Hello, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. Thanks for joining us for the afternoon session. My name is Paul Thompson. I'm WCN's Director of Conservation Programs. I'm really excited to introduce this session here. I'm going to let you in on a little WCN secret. We position most of our programs through a single species focus, right? So today you've heard about macaws, great crowned cranes, lions, but you've probably also figured it out that what we're really doing is we're having a conservation impact at a landscape level. So at WCN, we talk a lot about scale. If we're going to rise to meet the challenge and the size of the threats we're facing out there, we have to do it at scale. But when you're looking to save individual cotton-top tamarins or populations of pumas here in California, what does that actually mean working at scale, right? How do you galvanize the support of different communities, government officials, and others to make that happen? How do you balance the needs of wildlife with the needs of people and economic development? So in this session, we're going to be traveling from Colombia to across Africa and right here in our own backyard in California to find out. So I'm really excited to introduce our three speakers today, who are three of my favorite conservationists and human beings as well. We have Rosamira Guillen with the Proyecto Titi. For 18 years, they've been working in Colombia to protect the cotton-top tamarin. We have Dr. Peter Lindsay with the Lion Recovery Fund. Working across Africa, and I'm happy to say that this year not only is WCN's 20th anniversary, but it's the 5-year mark for the LRF, and it's doing really well. And then the rising star on our team, Neil Sharma, who's the head of our new California Wildlife Program. And we're just 1 year into that program, but as you're about to hear, it's already gaining a lot of traction. So let's dive in, and I'll hand it over to Rosamira.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you all for being here today. One pound, that is the weight of that little guy there in that tree. Big, little, about the size of a squirrel. It's a ball of fur, but with a very cool hairdo. And regardless of the difference in size with us humans, is surprisingly very similar to us. They live in family groups like we do, mom, dad, and babies. Babies learn everything from their parents, just like we do. They leave home when they're teenagers or get kicked out of the house, like it happens with us as well. They're very, very territorial, very protective of their home in the forest and their family. And they have a very sophisticated communication system like we do, and that is used to care for each other, just like we do, to protect from natural predators or any threats, or humans for that matter. And so, yeah, so it's very, very similar, this little monkey. But what makes it very, very unique is the fact that it's only found in that little red dot of our big planet. That's it. It's the country of Colombia. And not even in the whole country, but just in that little black stripe north of Colombia, where I was born and raised as well. Unfortunately, just like many other species around the planet, cotton-tops are facing significant threats, and mostly associated with deforestation. Deforestation that gives way to cattle ranching, agriculture, mining, urban development, which are all very common activities in northern Colombia. And not only deforestation, but also something we call fragmentation, which is clearing areas between, isolating forests because you clear one area. And when you think about a 1-pound monkey that always hangs up in the trees, never comes down to the ground, this is a huge problem. It's a huge problem for finding resources. It's a huge problem for mating, for finding shelter and food, and even, problems with inbreeding that can happen in the long term. So we're facing deforestation and fragmentation as big challenges, and those have gotten cotton tops to be critically endangered. That is why we at Proyecto TT have focused a lot of our efforts over the past 10 years in protecting the forest. It's the main threat. This is what we need to do. But we have to be very creative on how we do that. We would love to purchase the whole north region of Colombia and protect it for wildlife, but it's not unreal. It's not real. So we have combined strategies. We have worked with the environmental authorities to create public protected areas, which up to date is more than 13,000 acres that we have been able to protect in public protected areas. But we have also created our own forest reserve, thanks to many of you guys that have supported us with this ambition to protect more and more land, and have created a reserve that has, thanks to you guys, has gone over 1,200 acres of forest that is protected by a national park. But then we also need to create green highways between these isolated forests so that monkeys can move around from one place to another, and then we can battle the fragmentation issue. So in order to protect cotton-top tamarins, we need to protect their landscape, their habitat, their ecosystem. And while we do that, we're protecting the home of many other species that share a home with cotton-top tamarins. Even though we focus on this very cute little monkey, we are saving the home of many different birds, reptiles, amphibians, mammals. It's just really a huge biodiversity living in this forest. It's not only the forest, but these corridors that we are creating, which are great for cotton tops, are very good also for spider monkeys, howler monkeys, capuchin monkeys, and ocelots, and all sorts, deer, all sorts of animals. And that is a concept that is being replicated all around the planet. It is the case of mountain lions, pumas, here in California, right, Neil, in the California landscape?
Absolutely right. So here in California, and I know we have a lot of Californians in the room, so you can appreciate the amazing biodiversity that we have right here at home. At the same time, the pace and scale of habitat loss and fragmentation is just staggering here. I was born and raised in California. I've spent my whole life here, and in that time, yes, we have seen some tremendous wins for conservation, and yet we see some really troubling patterns continue to threaten wildlife and the integrity of our ecosystems here in the state. So it's understandable that there's a lot of concern within the conservation community about ecological connectivity. When WCN launched the California Wildlife Program in 2021, we set the focus on connectivity, recognizing how fundamentally important that is for ecosystems that are healthy, that are functional, that are resilient to change, including climate change. I like this visual because I think it provides a good snapshot of connectivity throughout the state of California. This is modeling that was developed by the Nature Conservancy, and it looks at landscape characteristics. And so generally speaking, those darkest areas are less intact, less connected, and those brightest areas are still connected, but somewhat constrained by conversion and other issues in the landscape. And so we can start by looking at the landscape features, but then we need to think about how these on-the-ground issues affect a given species. How do they affect its life and livelihood? This is one of the top concerns we have right now regarding large landscape fragmentation. This is the mountain lion or puma, the cougar, the same animal. I'll probably call it a puma, that's my habit. And to the Californians, this is our mysterious and elusive neighbor. So maybe you've encountered one, maybe you've seen one on a camera, and if not and you've been hiking, chances are you were in proximity of a puma just hiding out. So the issue that we have here is that, particularly on the Central Coast in Southern California, there are puma populations that aren't able to interbreed. They're not able to exchange genetic material, and we're already starting in some cases to see the signs of inbreeding. We know that doesn't bode well for the viability of these populations and their important role in healthy, functional ecosystems. And we can also look at pumas as indicators of landscape fragmentation. Right, this is an animal that can occupy a wide variety of habitats, covers a lot of ground, can navigate many issues. And so in some places where it's really running into trouble with connectivity, chances are that's affecting other species as well. One of the ways we're addressing this through the California Wildlife Program is by funding on-the-ground fine-scale studies that are being conducted by the Wildlife Health Center at UC Davis. There are certain geographies in California that we know are crucial for connectivity and at the same time are data deficient. So these efforts are going to yield the kind of fine-scale information that will inform the subsequent conservation actions to come. One example of this is down near Southern California, the Tehachapi Mountains, a bit of a linchpin of connectivity between the Western Sierra, large areas of habitat in Southern California, and those coastal ranges of the Central Coast. And so the researchers are out there scouting the terrain, tracking pumas, and over the next several years, they'll be tracking these animals' movements using GPS collars. They'll also be paying attention to the highways. So down to the southwest, that's I-5, or the 5 for the Southern California people, and the other road is Highway 58. And so in addition to tracking the cats with the collars, the researchers will also be monitoring these highways using motion-censored cameras to figure out if and how pumas and other wildlife are finding safe passage using structures that weren't built with wildlife in mind, but we know that if suitable, they'll find them and they'll use them. So that's an important part of the picture here. And so this is a kind of a foundational investment that will inform everything from the location and design of wildlife crossing infrastructure to land protection through acquisition or policy work. And it's a study that takes place at the landscape scale, but fits into a bigger regional picture and then furthermore into a statewide conservation strategy. And so where the California Wildlife Program is working throughout California and at a statewide level, the Lion Recovery Fund is working at a continental scale in Africa. So I'm going to hand the mic to Peter to take us from here.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, so I feel like I've got a hard act to follow after the two fantastic lion speakers earlier, so congrats to those guys. Just for those of you who are not familiar with the Lion Recovery Fund, basically what it is a funding mechanism that supports a whole host of different projects, much like the Nyasa Lion Project and Owasso and projects like that around Africa. And also other projects that are less lion-focused and more focused on protecting landscapes. So when I started with the Lion Recovery Fund, the fund was launched 5 years ago. It was a really strong part of the philosophy that it shouldn't be too lion-focused. It should be about protecting the savanna ecosystems in which the species occurs. So I want to talk to you today about how the LRF, as it's called in brief, helps to benefit both landscapes and other species. So the first thing to note is that lions are a keystone species. So as an apex predator, they play a critical ecological role. And if they were to be removed from the system, there'd be a whole host of cascading ecological effects that would have a lot of deleterious impacts for other species. And so it's really important to have them there as part of the fauna. They're an umbrella species, meaning that their requirements for large intact habitats and intact prey populations mean that they're a very strong proxy for ecosystem health. So if an area could support lions, they can generally support pretty much every other species as well, almost. And they're also very good flagship species. So they're one of the world's best known animals. They're very popular and they're a very good vehicle with which to attract funding to invest in the protection of savanna landscapes writ large. So the kind of interventions that we fund are beneficial not just for lions but for other species too. And as I said, a really big part of the philosophy that we don't get too focused on lions because there's a lot of biodiversity out there to support. So, excuse the grim photo. So we invest in a variety of different types of projects. So one of them is a project designed to reduce direct mortality of lions. And so one type of mortality of lions comes from poisoning. This poor lion was poisoned. And you can imagine the poisoning doesn't just affect lions, it affects hyenas, all other carnivores, vultures, everything. And so if we can tackle that issue, we can keep all of the carnivorous guild safe, essentially, at least from that threat. And then perhaps the biggest threat to lions is through loss of their prey. As prey numbers decline, lion numbers decline in very short order. The biggest threat to prey populations comes in from the bushmeat trade, which is often undertaken. Hunting, poaching for wildlife is often done with these wire snares. wire snares can kill animals ranging from kind of 5 kgs up to elephants. And so by removing snares through projects that we support, the LRF can help to secure a whole range of other wildlife that's really critical. And obviously, preventing habitat loss is key from a landscape level, but also for every single species that occurs in those habitats. So just another example. The biggest type of investment that the Lion Recovery Fund makes, and this is a bit surprising to some people, so we do support a lot of lion projects, but we also support a lot of projects that are designed to manage conservation areas and protected areas in Africa. Africa is gifted with a truly massive protected area network. We actually have really more than enough land to conserve lions. If these protected areas were managed optimally, they could support 3 or 4 times the number of wild lions that we have today. But they're desperately underfunded. And when they're underfunded, they become vulnerable to human pressures such as poaching and encroachment. It's a bit like the human body. If you don't resource it, don't look after it properly, it becomes vulnerable to all sorts of threats. So by investing in the protection and management of protected and conserved areas, it helps to protect the habitat and all of the species that occur therein. Another way in which the LRF helps to benefit landscapes and species is through its sheer breadth. We've been going for 5 years now. We've got investments in 23 different countries, and this encompasses a very wide range of different habitats. So savanna habitats are the main type, but of course there's a great diversity of different kinds of savannas. But then there's forest edge, gallery forests, forest savanna mosaics such as this, and then there's also kind of semi-arid environments that you get in the far northeast of Africa and the far southwest of Africa. And you can imagine that these different habitat types have very different collateral biodiversity that benefits from LRF investment. So in terms of the kind of species that benefit from Lion Recovery Fund investment, I'm looking for Peter Blinston in here because I think he's the man who said that the only good lion is a dead lion, but we'll talk. He was joking. He was joking. We're good friends. So, he's going to kill me for that. So wild dogs have very similar habitat requirements to lions. And so the Lion Recovery Fund is presently investing in about 33% of wild dog range, including in some of the places in Africa where wild dogs are at their most vulnerable. Examples... Thank you. Examples include places like Senegal, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Angola, all of the northern Mozambique, all of these kind of really remote places where wild dogs are really on the edge, but actually very critical for that species. So the Lion Recovery Fund is arguably at the moment one of the most significant funders for wild dog conservation out there. So I love wild dogs. That's my kind of sort of biological root. Hey? Giraffes, another example. So although lions obviously eat giraffes and molest wild dogs, as Peter likes to say, so there was a great paper that came out recently by the Giraffe Conservation Foundation that showed that there's potentially 4 giraffe species, not just one. The Lion Recovery Fund has got landscape protection projects within the distribution of all 4 of those putative species, so that's quite cool. Another example of collateral biodiversity that benefits from the investments of the LRF are the species that occur in West and Central Africa. So West and Central Africa is home to the northern subspecies of the African lion, which is much more threatened than the lions that occur in Southern and East Africa. But wildlife in general is under a lot of pressure there. And so by investing disproportionately in West and Central Africa, we also help to support the animals that occur there, such as this magnificent bongo antelope, or Lord Derby eland, or Western roan, or Western hartebeest, these kind of creatures. So, yeah, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight as to how the fund benefits landscapes and other species. I'm going to hand it back to Neil, and I think it's really interesting because so Africa is a continent that's changing very, very quickly. I read somewhere recently when I was writing a scientific paper that Africa is developing and changing faster than any continent has ever changed before. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I could see it changing in front of my eyes. And in many senses, I think the conditions that exist in the US are a little bit of an eye into the future as to what some of the challenges might be for wildlife in Africa in future. So I'll be really interested to hear what you've got to say, Neil. Maybe we can learn from it.
Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you. I always appreciate hearing Peter's insights, and I think a lot of those lessons to be learned and the challenges that we're dealing with here have to do with both the scale and the nature of the built environment here in California. So one of the big challenges we have really throughout the state is linear infrastructure, highways in particular, but that's not the only challenge. In cases, these are features that can contribute to direct mortality through roadkill. In some cases, they present a barrier effect where animals aren't even willing to approach the infrastructure, and that has a profound fragmentation effect on ecosystems that might otherwise be intact or are maybe tenuous but hanging on by a thread. So a big issue for us to deal with. So this is a graphic that just shows the highways and freeways in the state. Doesn't show other roads, doesn't show other forms of linear infrastructure, but we can see how extensive it is. And so in the very early days of the California Wildlife Program, we realized that there's no centralized and totally up-to-date inventory of all the different wildlife crossing priorities and projects in California. So really a foundational resource that we felt would be important to invest in, ranging from sites that have been identified through an on-the-ground study that say this is important, all the way to a place where folks are trying to fundraise to actually build something like a wildlife bridge or an undercrossing tunnel. And so through a grant from the California Wildlife Program, which operates much like the LRF, through funding to an NGO called the Wildlands Network, this resource is being developed right now. And so in relatively near future, we'll have this centralized, up-to-date database that we can work public, private, state, local NGOs and figure out how to advance these projects in parallel, more quickly, more efficiently, and in a coordinated way. So in addition to this broad-scale inventory and planning, groups are hard at work designing and getting these structures built. We have a lot to do, looking at the extent of the issue. And one example is from the same organization, the Wildlands Network. They're currently planning for a wildlife crossing on Highway 395 near the California-Nevada border. This is a place where there are migratory deer. So unlike deer that we have on the coast, these deer move between seasonal ranges, and this highway presents challenges for them. So yes, there are some wildlife crossing structures that are suitable, but it's not enough. These are somewhat surgical interventions, and what we need to do is make these roadways much more permeable. And so an additional, at least one more wildlife crossing structure is needed, so they're working on planning for a vegetated wildlife overpass that'll benefit the deer as well as many other species in this area that are having challenges with the road as well. Another example is in Santa Clara County, so northern part of the Central Coast. This is Highway 152, where it runs through Pacheco Pass in the Diablo Range. Largely intact habitat, but with this highway running through it. And so through a grant from the California Wildlife Program and other funders, a group called the Santa Clara Valley Habitat Agency is doing a lot of great work out there. As I mentioned, the habitat's largely intact and they're working on protecting it, but they're also working on addressing the highway issues. So similarly to Highway 395, the wheels are in motion, really bad pun for this. The process is in motion to develop a large vegetated wildlife overpass, because this is a landscape that has elk in it, and they need something large. They're averse to going under the road, and there are many other species that would benefit from that kind of infrastructure. But in the near term, we can work on enhancing what's on the ground, trying to tackle some of this low-hanging fruit on a shorter time scale, like this culvert that these bobcats are using, or this underpass that these deer are using, or this gray fox that found this culvert has been using it. So what this looks like is installing fencing on the highway to keep animals off the road and guide them to these structures. Because we do see situations where might have a mated pair or a family using an existing structure, and at some point one or more of them gets killed on the road right by the structure. And it's heart-wrenching every time, and it's something that we can address sooner than later, while we also work on the big fixes that we know we also need. The roads are a big challenge, and not the only challenge. The patterns of sprawl and habitat loss are really the counterpart to the issues presented by roads, and we're working to address that as well. And I'll go more into sprawl issues and how we're engaging with that, but I want to highlight first one example which was quite early in the program, and this is a land protection project that through California Wildlife Program funding, the Trust for Public Land protected this really important property in this constrained choke point or pinch point linkage between the Santa Cruz Mountains and the Diablo Range. a piece in the puzzle of a multi-step effort to really conserve this tenuous landscape. So this is an outline of the ranch, about 540 acres right on the edge of the town of San Juan Bautista, San Benito County, effectively holding the line from sprawl and subdivision that would decrease the value of this important and already constrained linkage area. It's important back to the issue of reconnecting puma populations for genetic flow, but it has a nice variety of habitats between the grasslands, the oak woodlands, the water resources between ponds and wetlands, so it provides a variety of habitat for a diverse array of wildlife. I also want to mention the long-term management and stewardship approach for this project, which I think is really thoughtful. So the Trust for Public Land is working with local land trusts, including the Amamutsun tribal band, to develop a long-term management strategy, and I think that's just another really important layer to this project. So, as is the case with the wildlife crossing work, both the statewide inventory and some on-the-ground implementation, or this land protection project, which fits in a smaller scale but still landscape scale planning, both of these highlight the importance of taking that broader view, the importance of conservation planning that then informs the implementation of the on-the-ground projects. And I know there are parallels with what Proyecto TT is doing in Colombia, so I'm going to pass the mic to Rosamira.
Thank you, Neil. Yes. So really, when we talk about planning and about land planning, basically what we're trying to do is just balance out the needs of wildlife with the needs of humans, right? That's why we try to kind of get organized so that everybody can get what they need. In our case, what we need is trees and corridors so that cotton tops can make those nice jumps and move around during the landscape and not be, caught up on an island where you cannot, move forward. And us people, or people at least in our local communities, they need to survive. They need to provide for their families. They need to make their land productive for food and for income. And traditionally, they have done it in a way that you just wipe everything off and then, come back with 1 or 2 crops a year, and that's it. And then they struggle the rest of the time during the dry season and all throughout the year. And this was the case of Salvador, one of the farmers we work with. Salvador and his family were displaced from his farm when he was a teenager due to the socio-political situation in Colombia that went on for 5-6 decades, and the violence in the rural areas and the drug conflict and all sorts of issues that forced them to leave their land and struggle for so many years to make a living. Fortunately, with the peace agreement that was signed in Colombia a few years ago, Salvador was able to come back, claim his land, come back as a older man, ready to his land, the land of his family, but he had nothing to invest in making it productive. So what we offered to Salvador, with the partner organizations was, okay, let's just do a conservation agreement. Let's try to plan on something that works for you and works for wildlife. So why don't we work on a model where you set aside part of your property and you allow us to come in and plant trees and bring back the forest, and then you use the rest of your land. You will help you with investment in trees, seeds, timber trees, poultry, honey production, a couple of cows for milk and for meat. And he went for it. And basically, what we're trying to do is get organized, try to leave some area for the monkeys and for wildlife through these corridors. We would prefer to have everything, as nice as within the corridor, but people need to make a living. And then as part of this program, we also encourage the use of environmentally friendly practices. So instead of slash and burn, just plant trees that you can harvest from, fruit and all sorts of different things, and not just one crop, and damage the land so bad when you burn the land to clear it from the weeds. And then sure enough, we make this planning at the property level so that we can just balance out those needs of people and a landscape. But then with that, we need to zoom out a little and make sure that the corridor within Salvador's property matches the corridor with his neighbor and the other neighbor, and we can really make a green highway in there. And this is what, this colorful map, this is what we're doing, all the properties that are participating in this program, and to make sure that those corridors connect to our protected area, the private protected area that we created in dark green, and the national park that we are adjacent to, which is the light green. And that has allowed many families in this area to make a better living, to learn to do this, environmentally friendly practices, and more land for the monkeys to move around in this area. Now we're getting quite ambitious, and with this, many years learning how to do this right, we now want to take this to the regional level. So you see the little map on top is the bigger map that I was showing you before. And we want to be able to take all this experience and all this model that is working very well to connect to protected areas and create a 20-mile big corridor. And for that, we're going to need to mix many different strategies, just as creating more protected areas, purchasing land to create, very sensitive to protect sensitive areas, and work with many, many other farmers to create those green highways that work for people and work for the monkeys. And for that, of course, that's our 10-year plan into the future, and we're going to need a lot of help. So we're counting on you for this. Yeah, and the great thing about these corridors is that they usually happen along waterways. And these waterways, when you protect the creeks and the streams, you are protecting water. Water that people need, the farmers need for their crops during the dry season, because where we live, it's like 6 months, it's completely dry, and then it rains like forever, the next 6 months. And then people struggle a lot. So by protecting these corridors along waterways or very steep areas that are hard to work, in farming, then we're also protecting these very important resources for people. And that is how we try to connect the farmers with the value of having these corridors. It's not only for the monkeys, it's for ourselves as well. We can have a resource for food, for wood, for water, which is everything that nature gives us. And, maybe they knew it, but they didn't realize how important it is. And then maybe, I don't know if they care that much about the monkeys as I do, but at least they care about their families, and they see that it's having a benefit for everybody, which is what we're trying to get. And then, of course, that's where we look for another type of connectivity. So it's not only connecting the forest, but it's connecting people to the forest and the wildlife. And I love this picture here because it's just like you enjoying, water. It's so vital for us humans. And then here's another story about, this is Luis. He's one of our staff now. Luis was logging wood from the forest for 20 years. When he was 16, his high school sweetheart got pregnant. So he had to leave everything aside and try to find a way to provide for his family. And he did this for 20 years. He just learned a lot about which trees had a lot of commercial value, where to find them, how did they grow, how fast, where he could cut it, how he could pull them out from the forest. And we met Luis when he was assisting the building of a fence on our protected area. And he heard our staff talking about all the trees and the seeds we needed to collect and what the monkeys eat and all of that. And he started kind of interacting with them. And we're like, man, you're a good resource for us. We need you. Come work with us. He, of course, had gotten in trouble so many times with authorities for being, for logging trees in protected areas, even in the national park. And Luis has been working with us for 5 years now. He's one of our very valuable people in our staff. He's become an expert in tracking monkeys now. And he himself says that we rescued him from being a logger, and then brought him to our side of the equation to, instead of cutting trees, just be able to help propagate these trees and build new forests. And Luis is part of a group of people that are all from the local community that we hire with permanent jobs, and that they help us rebuild the forest. They help us go out and collect the seeds, and all of those years of research about the monkeys have been very helpful in understanding which trees we need to plant for food, for shelter, And we germinate those in the nursery we have created thanks to your support within our reserve. And there's the guys there doing their thing every day. We, it's just a beautiful nursery, 50,000 saplings every year from 70 different tree species that are native from the forest. And Luis has been a very important part of all that. And with that, when the rainy season comes, then we go out and plant those trees in areas within the corridors that were used previously for cattle ranching and agriculture. And then we go out and monitor those trees, and again, it's like the reason for hope is to see those trees grow and become a forest, which is what we're hoping to achieve. And that gives us an opportunity to also hire more people from the community, because we're planting like 25,000 saplings every year. We need a lot of people to do that. And then we get to hire the other farmers that have also conservation agreements and their families. And that way, altogether, we're bringing back the forest. So if being from bringing back the forest or making beautiful plush toys that can deliver a message all around the planet, or making these beautiful handbags made with recycled plastic, what we want to do is connect people with nature and the importance of protecting the monkeys, how that benefits me, and how can I avoid, damaging the environment and having different sources to subsist for families. And ultimately, what we want to do is connect from the heart. Just make sure that you understand, increase the value, the social value, the environmental value, and also make it fun, right? Peter?
We need to get some wigs for our guys in Africa. So in this section, I wanted to talk to you about how, with the Lion Recovery Fund, we're also trying to create benefits for economies and for people. So Africa is a continent, as I said, that's growing quickly. It's set aside an enormous area of land for conservation, but that comes at a big opportunity cost, for local people and economies, and for conservation to be politically and socially sustainable, we need to make sure that there are strong economic and social benefits that arise from it. And so I'm going to run you through a few examples of how, through the Lion Recovery Fund, we try and ensure that those benefits are in place. So the first example comes from the landscape approach that we've adopted that I alluded to earlier. By trying to invest in the protection of these really big wild landscapes, the LRF helps to protect ecosystem services. This is a term that's maybe a little bit kind of jargony, but it's basically the services that nature provides upon which economies and human beings depend. For example, the protection of watersheds and sources of fresh water. This is really, really important. And as Africa develops, it will become more and more pronounced as to how important these wild areas are. So a good example of this comes from the Eastern Central African Republic wilderness. It's the wildest place in the whole of Africa. Absolutely incredible place. And this wilderness encompasses the sources of no fewer than 7 major rivers. And you can imagine the tens of millions of people downstream from those areas depend upon those water as a lifeblood in urban areas and in rural areas. Another example is through the protection of natural vegetation that is such a critical store for carbon. I really feel that a missing piece in the fight against climate change, well, it's not really a missing piece, but it's an underappreciated piece. So much effort goes into reducing emissions and planting trees, and we kind of take for granted the real big wilderness areas. But in Africa, we've got such big wilderness areas remaining, or wild landscapes, but the human populations are growing very quickly, and so there's a lot of pressure on these areas. So we need to secure as many as we can to prevent kind of catastrophic carbon release, and also localized desertification, which is such a challenge in semi-arid Africa. Another category of benefits are this photo is maybe a bit confusing, but generally the securing the natural assets upon which so many people in rural Africa depend. So perhaps more than any other continent, people in rural parts of Africa are very dependent on direct utilization of natural resources for survival, whether it's thatching grass or grazing for livestock or charcoal or firewood or non-timber forest products like mushrooms or mopani worms or bushmeat also. And the challenge is if you just allow completely unfettered access to these natural resources, there's a risk that they'll disappear and thus people will become much poorer. But if you can secure core protected areas and then have kind of big multiple use zones around there where some form of utilization of these assets is permitted, as is commonly the case in Africa, then then these kind of assets can be enshrined in perpetuity for rural communities, which is important. In addition, on a related note, the LRF invests in the protection of natural assets that form the basis for green economy, so principally through tourism, but in future through the sale of carbon credits or biodiversity credits. But tourism is the really obvious and immediate one. So particularly in Southern and East Africa, tourism is a very significant component of national economies and a major employer. But if we don't protect the assets on which the tourism industry depends, then the tourism industry disappears. So that's really important. And again, on a related note, we're also investing in the formation, the governance, and the management of community conservation areas, also wildlife areas on community land. And this is really important as a land use diversifier. So in Africa, as climate change proceeds and as rainfall becomes less reliable and more erratic, livestock keeping, we heard from Shivani's presentation earlier how vulnerable livestock farming is to climate change and droughts. Wildlife is vulnerable too, but it is well adapted to semi-arid and arid environments. And so it's a way to diversify incomes and reduce reliance on traditional agriculture. And it can be a complement to those land uses too. So that's quite important. Another category of benefits is trying to work on projects that reduce the cost that local people bear from living with wildlife. This is really important because species like lions are not easy to live with. They are a challenge. They are a threat to human life in some instances, and they do eat livestock quite readily if that's not controlled. Thankfully, there are through the pioneering work of Shivani and other projects like that around Africa, there's some really effective tools at reducing and tackling human-lion conflict. I think there's Ingela Janssen here too from the Cope Lion Project in Tanzania that also do fantastic work in terms of tackling human-lion conflict. By working with communities to try and improve livestock husbandry through, for example, improved corralling, so the livestock are in safe cattle corrals at night, so they're not so easily caught by predators. By working to improve the herding, so for example, this kind of scene is pretty common where you have a young boy looking after livestock, and those livestock are fairly vulnerable to depredation by lions or other animals because children are not, generally speaking, the best herders. And so working to improve the herding, improve the corralling, and also help to find lost livestock. That's another benefit that many of the projects that we support help with, because if livestock are lost, they become very vulnerable to being stolen by people or being killed by lions or other predators. So there's a whole kind of slew of livestock husbandry type interventions that the LRF supports around Africa. But it's not just about reducing costs, it's also about creating incentives for conservation. So during Colleen's talk, we heard about her performance payments program, which has been a really pioneering effort. And this has been replicated in several areas around Africa. This project, for example, in southern Tanzania does something very similar to what Colleen outlined earlier, whereby on community land, a number of camera traps are put out, and then communities are rewarded based on the number, distribution, and diversity of wildlife that are caught in the camera traps. So it's a really strong incentive for coexistence. Because as I said, it's not easy to coexist with lions and elephants and creatures like that. And then on a related note, I think one of the philosophies we're trying to pursue is the notion of positioning and rewarding communities as custodians over nature on behalf of the world. Local communities, indigenous people really have the power to make conservation succeed or fail. So if they're marginalized or if they feel like their rights are impinged upon, they can cause infinite problems for conservation efforts. Conversely, if their rights are recognized, if they're empowered, if they're brought into conservation efforts, they can absolutely make a tremendous positive difference. And I think there's a really exciting opportunity here. Instead of thinking about development aid or donor funding as a kind of handout or your short-term sort of white elephant projects that fail after a while. If we use a proportion of funding like that to hire local people to deliver environmental protection services on behalf of the world, it's a true win-win, because the world benefits from the protection of habitat and from biodiversity. And then equally, employment is the single most direct way in which you can provide benefits to local people in contexts where employment is so critically short, as is the case in much of rural Africa. An example of that is provided by some of the projects. So this is from Serengeti National Park in Tanzania, which is maybe the world's most iconic protected area. It's an amazing park. It's under a lot of pressure from snaring, and so we're supporting a project with Frankfurt Zoological Society and TANAPA, that's the Tanzania National Parks Authority. And they've got these de-snaring teams, and so there's regular TANAPA rangers in there, but they also hire ex-poachers to work with the rangers. And these guys are absolutely amazing, as you'd expect, at finding snares, because they know exactly where the poachers would come in, when they'd come in, where they would put the snares. And so by hiring those guys, you provide them with an alternative livelihood stream, and they are super effective at tackling poaching. Similarly, there's a bunch of projects like this around Africa. I actually think Shivani was one of the projects that, or Ewaso Lions, that kind of pioneered this approach, the kind of lion guardians approach, where you hire the young men that would typically be involved in hunting lions to protect livestock, hire them to work with communities to improve livestock husbandry and discourage communities from hunting lions. That can be really, really effective and a win-win all round. So the last category of benefits that I wanted to mention is trying to harness the kind of cultural and heritage values of wildlife. So many of the cultures in Africa is a tremendously diverse, wonderful, wonderful place. But there's a lot of affinity among different cultures for wildlife on the continent, and we need to make sure that our communities don't lose that connection or lose the wildlife. And so a good example is in Senegal. So the Senegalese soccer team is arguably the most successful football team in Africa. There might be some debate there, but they're right up there, right? And they're called the Lions of Teranga. But lions in Senegal were on the very, very brink of extinction until about 5 or 10 years ago. The NGO Panthera started working with the Senegalese authorities to support the management of Neokolokoba National Park with part funding from the Lion Recovery Fund, and the lion numbers there are starting to recover really strongly now. And so that provides a very strong basis, I think, for the Senegalese football team to go forth and dominate the World Cup. So I mean, hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview. I realize that with the Lion Recovery Fund, one of the challenges is it's a bit of a beast. It's big, it's very zoomed out, it's very macro. It's a beast of a project. It's got very ambitious goals. The idea is to recover the 50% or so of lions that disappeared in the last 25 years. So it's got very significant recurrent funding requirements, but equally small amounts of funding do go a long way. And so, so thanks for the opportunity to speak to you guys. And I'm going to hand over again to Neil. And again, I'll be really interested to see how the kind of socioeconomic situation in the US, which is so fundamentally different to Africa, how it differs in a conservation context, but also you'd expect some of the key things to be the same: reducing the costs, creating incentives, and connecting people with their wildlife heritage. Cheers.
Thanks, Peter. Right, so back to California. It's a little bit different, but at the core, there are core similarities in that we're primarily focused on biodiversity conservation, and to be effective with that, we need to be mindful of the other social issues that intersect and affect and are affected by conservation efforts. We're looking for balance. It just has a bit of a different texture, different flavor. Rosamira talked about balance. We're looking for our version of balance here. So California, we have the most people, and it's the most biodiverse state in the US. We have a legacy of sprawl, and that is the way that we have accommodated the human population from a land use standpoint. So that presents us with some really big current and long-term challenges. Sprawl looks like what we see in the photo. This is overlooking Santa Clara Valley, San Jose, which is where I live. So urban sprawl, suburban sprawl. We start to see also this lower density, what's sometimes called exurban sprawl, which still has a often negative impact on wildlife and can result in the conversion of habitat and working lands as well. There's also an unfortunate intersection with wildfire, which is a natural phenomenon in California, but the way we see it today is highly altered for many reasons. There's a lot of nuance there that I'm not going to unpack. I'm just going to leave it there and say that there's an unfortunate intersection between patterns of sprawl development, wildfire, and public safety, and then, of course, the impact on biodiversity. And so when we were developing the strategy for the California Wildlife Program, it wasn't so much a question of if we were going to engage in housing issues. It was a question of how is the appropriate way, most effective way for us to engage in that. Just knowing that these land use patterns are such a systemic driver of the fragmentation challenges that we see. And so where we've been focusing is on statewide land use policy. And the main example of this is a group called the Alliance for Housing and Climate Solutions. So this is a coalition that was launched with funding from the California Wildlife Program. It consists of more than 20 organizations balanced between housing and conservation and environment. And this group is focused on statewide policy, seeing what happens if these two sectors or movements, if you will, that have often been at odds, if we come together and look for areas of common ground and then start working on policy ideas that look for this balance. Trying to find places, for example, where we can make it easier to develop housing close to transit and jobs in certain types of existing communities where that's appropriate, while simultaneously working to protect the most important areas of habitat, and that includes connectivity in there, and habitat for those vital ecosystem functions that we all need. And so one of the things I find really exciting about the California Wildlife Program is in this first year and a half or so of the work, we have a really diverse set of approaches that we're funding, including policy work at the state level at the intersection of housing, land use, and conservation. So when we look at the Lion Recovery Fund in Africa, the work of Proyecto TT in Colombia, and California Wildlife Program here, different flavors, but similar tools. In each case, we're working at multiple scales using different tactics in portfolios that are complementary and mutually reinforcing. In each case, there's the importance of taking a broader view from a conservation planning standpoint along with that on-the-ground implementation. You know, whether it's a very rural setting or relatively or a downright urban context, as is the case in some of these places. One of the things I really appreciate about being part of WCN is this worldwide community of folks working on conservation and the endless opportunities that provides for learning and inspiration and thinking about an approach that is effective in one context and thinking about if and how that could be applied somewhere else. And it's a really productive and inspiring group to be a part of, and I want to thank you all for your support and thank you for being here.
We do have a couple of minutes for questions, but I hope that this session provided you a sense of the interconnected network that WCN truly is. So here we see that the threats are different, but a lot of the solutions are the same. So with that, I'd like to bring up the speakers here on stage. Do we have a question from the audience? Thank you.
Regarding climate, I wondered if you could speak to two things regarding landscapes. One is renewable energies that are taking landscapes out of commission that we need, but they also are competitive with that. And then the second thing around climate is in the future that we will start to see migrations away from these areas into other, where the climates move. And how is that impacting how you're designing the landscapes when we need to migrate these places further?
Rosemary, do you want to talk about how climate change is visible in Colombia?
Yeah, actually, it is a challenge for us as humans, but it's a challenge for the monkeys as well, exactly because what you're saying is like if you change the patterns of climate, that's going to screw up the whole biology and the patterns that they do with the living, the regular habits. But I think what we're trying to do is somehow stop or put a halt on that pervasive expansion of development, and somehow recover little by little a more balanced landscape that can avoid, in the case of cotton-top tamarins and wildlife in Colombia, that migration, both in horizontally and in altitude as well, which is happening as well. And also, at the same time, if you have more healthy forests and you have areas that are reclaimed and that somehow find the balance within the landscape, then the chances of these natural disasters that we're seeing in the slides and the fires are certainly going to go down. I know it's very ambitious to say that, but I think that we're on the right path to try to get that balance. And it's never going to be like the 100% of one thing or the other, because we're coexisting here. But I'm hopeful that with this planning issues and with these approaches, we're going to be able to just balance it out for both and avoid a harsher impact of changes in the landscape.
There's a question back here. Peter?
I have a question. Oh boy. I'm in trouble now.
Might have to wrap
But
this up
actually,
early.
surprisingly not for Peter. I'll leave that to later. Neil, you mentioned at the beginning about signs of inbreeding in the puma. And I'm just kind of wondering what are those signs and how you're trying to address that? What measures you're putting in place to address that?
Yeah, so from what I understand from the scientists working on this, we're seeing some of the telltale signs that were, I think first observed in the Florida panther, perhaps the kinked tail, some impacts on reproductive viability in the males around the sperm. And so there's current research going on to further explore what's going on with the genetic situation, what's deleterious, what does this mean relative to some of the restoration interventions we're trying to do. So there's a lot of nuance to try to unpack, but we know enough to know that based on a series of genetic studies that have been done in the state, there's a lot of researchers working on that. We know that there are these effectively isolated populations that we need to get reconnected, and now we're trying to figure out where and how to prioritize between these multiple populations that need that connectivity.
So Pete, you showed a map earlier of the entire protected area real estate across the continent. When you're working at a scale like that, how do you, in your role at the LRF, sort of prioritize what landscapes we're going to be looking at supporting?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a number of ways, but to really simplify it down, we look at, is the landscape important for lions or potentially important? Is there a strong actor that's going to be able to make a difference? Do they have a mandate? And would LRF funding make a transformational difference? And if the answer to those four really simple questions is yes, they stand a fairly good chance of qualifying for funding. Within that, we obviously have to try and get some good, you have to stratify it a bit so that we have good broad representation, but that's a good rule of thumb as to how we apply the funding.
Right. Question up here?
Sorry. There's a lot of information there and sort of packed in, but I'm wondering if it can be, is there an overarching goal? If you had to say 10 years from now, we are going to ... What are we going to see, hopefully see?
Yeah, the long-term goal for the program is functional connectivity for the diversity of wildlife throughout California. That is long-term, perhaps perpetual. And so we've walked that back, and I'm going to arrive at the closer to 10-year goal. We're focused on restoring and maintaining opportunities for carnivore dispersal as well as ungulate migration, so we start to hone in a bit. And I would say within the next 10 years, we need to see real big progress to reconnect, especially the coastal, the Central Coast and Southern California puma populations and the ecosystems they're a part of.
And so, Neil, just briefly on that point, maybe some folks in the audience are familiar with California's 30 by 30 initiative, and how does some of the work that we're doing through our California program tie into that?
I would say it's totally supportive. So the 30 by 30 initiative is part of the global effort to conserve 30% of 30% of land area for biodiversity by 2030, and we're getting close to 2030. But and there's nuance. How do you measure, and what are you counting? But that's the fun stuff, right? So in California, that's really centered around protected areas, protected area management, as well as connecting people with equitable access to nature, whatever that looks like. And so I'd say that, throughout the portfolio of work that we're doing, it's directly supportive of that, although we are not officially tied to that effort. But I think we could say that's the case for many of the conservation efforts throughout California, is that we're feeding up into this bigger statewide vision.
Great. Question for Rosamira. You've been in the WCN network for a number of years now, and congratulations on your board appointment. We're thrilled about that. And WCN being a network that it is, how have you learned from or collaborated with other partners, whether they're from Latin or South America or even other continents, that might be similar to some of the work you do to advance landscape conservation?
I see the network as therapy, basically. It's group therapy. So yeah, I think the huge value of that is to have somebody you can communicate and you share the same challenges, and just to talk about it sometimes is just like therapy. Just talk about it and be able to have understand each other on that. But the power of understanding and visiting another partner and learning what has worked and what has not worked as well has been very constructive for us. In our case, in Proyecto TT, it was also a little bit of a challenge that WCN put us into at the beginning. In the first few years, it's like, you need to grow. So grow so you can grow your impact. And that certainly was also a big push, with support on many cases, not only financial support, but also organizational support, marketing support, just advice, not only from WCN, but from the amazing donors that are associated with this organization. So I think it goes many different levels, and organizations like ours are very little that wanted to do a lot, but really needed the support of the partners and of the donors, and it has been definitely a recipe of success in our case and what we have accomplished thanks to that. But I think the power of the network is exactly that, just being able to share, ask, see other mothers that are working, see they apply to you or not. And again, share successes, but share also things that didn't work, and you save time to your colleagues, right? So it's definitely, to me, is the strong value of the network. Again, through partners, through staff, and through the supporters of WCN.
Awesome. All right, that's all the time we have for questions at the moment. So a round of applause for the speakers, please. Thank you. So right now we're going to be taking a short break. And at 3:15/3:20, please join us back in here for the Small Mammal Conservation Organization from Nigeria, and then downstairs, as followed by Save the Elephants and the Elephant Crisis Fund. Downstairs we have painted dogs and cheetahs in Botswana, and Blue Angels up on the roof. Thanks so much.